All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Watch This with Rick Ramos. As always, this is your host, Rick Ramos. As always, my co host and producing partner, Mr. Ibrahim Chavez. We're thrilled to be continuing our descent into the horror film genre as we approach that wonderful All Hallows Eve that is just sitting there waiting for us, giving us an opportunity to scare each other with all kinds of ghouls and other good times. So, in the past couple of weeks, we've talked Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. Last week, we talked a documentary, a Shudder documentary, horror noir. This week, we're going to get back into films. So the week before that, we did Nicholas Ray's, no, not Nicholas Ray, Nicholas Rogue's Don't Look
Yeah.
Back. Now we are
Don't
diving.
look now.
Don't look. I'm all over the fucking place today. Don't Look Back is the great Bob Dylan. A whole other horror story, I guess. I don't know what the fuck you want to call it. Anyway, Don't Look Now. So this week we go across the pond again into Irish filmmaker Neil Jordan's The Company of Wolves. Now, I had never seen this film. I was excited to see it, and unfortunately for me, sometimes a film doesn't live up to the hype. Or it doesn't live up to the expectations. I don't know what my podcast partner is going to say. I don't know what his feelings are. As far as I'm, as far as I understand, we both went into this film blindly, but we're both very excited about watching it. So you got an idea of how I feel, Mr. Chavez. What was your impression of this film from what, the late 80s, early 90s?
It's it's mid 80s,
Mm-hmm.
84.
Okay.
Um, I first heard about it. Um, I think probably in the documentary that we did last year, episode 406 in the archives. Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched.
Yes.
Um,
A
so for
great
this,
film.
yeah, it's a massive uh, folk horror documentary.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know what to expect. We're thinking werewolf.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what we get. But I was pleasantly surprised
Mm-hmm.
because it's not what you would just think of as a straight horror. It's like a dark fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
gothic horror um,
Yeah.
film, and it's not. It's for me. It's well. There's the style of it. Neil Jordan. We talked about this is a good director. Um, Early in Jordan's career. This is before the Crying Game and that kind of like the little hushed, low tones of the hype that were about that. Before Interview with the Vampire, it's uh, I realizing, and I mean I knew this to a certain extent, but I'm realizing how much I like dark fantasy, especially like 80s dark fantasy and all of that means. All of the kind of the spookiness, the beauty, but also a little bit of the cheesy look of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like that, and I want to get into that more. Um, if I was able, letting go of the is this fucking horror? Is letting go of the category of it? I was just able to kind of just go with the story, and then I learned about Angela Carter, the writer behind the story,
Mm-hmm.
and her adaptation of these fairy tales. Um, Now I have, I'm waiting to get some of her shit from the library, including this Bloody Chamber. It's this series of adapted feminist stories. So I was pleasantly surprised. Had I been like, oh, fucking horror, this and that, then I could say like I was disappointed.
Yeah.
But I was surprised, and it was one of the moments where you root for the monster because the horror story is not the monster. The horror story is society telling you how to be. Um, but we'll get into that. What disappointed you about it?
Well, I think for me, I think it was a film that was in search of a purpose. It had tone, and it was beautiful to look at. There were moments here that I'm watching this film and I'm like, God, my God, the production design is phenomenal. And as I understand it, Stanley Kubrick, after having seen this film, hired the production designer to work on, I believe it was Full Metal Jacket, which in itself was a hell of a production design because it was recreating Vietnam in the south of London or the east of London. I can't remember exactly where. But this is definitely a beautiful film to look at that is really well photographed, and I found myself wanting it to be a better movie. So it just couldn't deliver. It left me bored. I wasn't interested. I felt like there was a I felt like there was a flirting with the type of film that it wanted to be without being brave enough to go full on into it. Now with fairy tales, and predominantly female led fairy tales, Alice in Wonderland, Little Red Riding Hood, and some of these, there's oftentimes a sexual aspect. Well, with the Little Red Riding Hood series, especially with the Little Red Riding Hood, especially the way it's been interpreted, the way it's been presented, there's a sexualization of the dangers of the wolf as a man. There's a sexual undertone to it, and it is here. It exists here, and yet Jordan doesn't explore it in a manner that he hints at in the beginning. And I feel as though there's a fear to go there with the material and that's my main problem with the film, is that it after I realized that it wasn't going to take itself to its logical conclusion, I really kind of got bored with it, and a number of times I had to rewind to watch again in order to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, because I found myself becoming increasingly distracted. That's my main problem with the film, is that it simply wasn't engaging after such a magnificent production design. I just felt like it was a pretty wrapper and no substance to the gift itself. That was my take
So
on it.
see, I see it differently because I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of substance there, which
Yeah.
I'll get into. But so what's this end that you would have wanted it to get to? What is the conclusion that you were looking for that you didn't get?
I can't speak to that because I can only allow the film to wash over me. I mean, it's the director and the writer's job to uh, to create something captivating, to create something compelling. So uh, I wanted I wanted a greater darkness. Either I wanted either more physical danger or more psychological danger. Psychological danger that hints towards the physical, and I didn't feel as though it was. I felt a lot of it was just really obvious and uninspired. It was material that has been gone over numerous times without bringing anything really new to it. Um,
See, because I think it's the flipping it's flipping it on its head. So I think it is actually new. What I'm curious about though is that you're saying I get you're saying
mhm,
okay, I didn't feel the danger,
yeah.
um, but you're talking about that it should have gone to a logical conclusion. What is
Okay.
that
The logical
conclusion?
conclusion is the sexual danger of what we've what we've become accustomed to in adult-oriented um, children's fairy tales.
Which is
So
what?
sexualization, the sexual danger that's there, the not just the potential for sexual violence, but really this young girl's. fascination with it and her attraction. I just didn't feel like it I just didn't feel like it played out in a way that was really.
But that's what I'm trying to get at. Is like,
Hmm.
okay, I understand all of what where I get where you're coming from, but I want to know when you say logical conclusion or where it played out, what is that thing? How should it have played
Well, I just
out?
didn't
Like,
feel like it really had much of a. It didn't explore the greater significance of the fairy tales as we've come to know them. It just kind of, the grandmother dies, the girl becomes a wolf. It's, it goes into that direction. Um, I wanted more of
so
a struggle. I wanted more of an understanding of what her feelings were because it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear, um, and I don't think that it was. I don't think it was either. I don't think that everything has to be explicit,
I
but
would hope not. Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't have to be explicit, and it shouldn't be explicit. It should be something a little bit more nuanced. It should be there, but you need to explore certain aspects of a young, like in this story, it hints. Okay, so the problem is that it hints at aspects. It hints at story that doesn't play out.
Like
You,
what?
her burgeoning sexuality, her movement from
I
young
mean, I
woman
think it's
to.
very obvious. I mean, it's not very.
It's
This is an
obvious.
allegory.
It's obvious, but
So
it
then,
doesn't play out story
so
wise. So it's
so what do you
all.
want?
I don't know. That's not my job. My job is
Yeah,
not
but
to. No,
yes,
no,
yes.
no. My
Mm,
job is to. My job is to sit there and be overwhelmed by what a director creates. So the
yeah,
failing is
but
in what is put on the screen.
I understand, but the I think what I'm missing is you're saying, well, it's not what it should have been, and I'm like, okay, what should it have been? Um, according to the way it sets itself out,
Hmm.
according to the logic of this thing,
Okay.
you're saying it should have been this, and I'm like, okay, what should have been? You're like, that's not my problem
It
to
should
say
have.
what it should have been. That's their problem.
If you want to look at it from that perspective, then what it should have
It's
been was a
I'm just listening
deeper.
to what you're saying.
Yeah, it should have been a deeper and more. Um, it should have been a deeper and more fully realized exploration of her changing from her coming to understand herself as a young woman. It's weird because there's the only thing that I could really think of when I was watching it is I mentioned to you HBO series called The Deuce, and
Yeah.
it's about sex workers in Times Square between in 71, I think 77, and then 85. So it's like 7 year period between 71, 78, 75, whatever. And in this show, Maggie Gyllenhaal's character moves up from being a streetwalker to uh, a minor porno pornography actress sensation into filming and making pornography. And one of her steps, one of the films that really puts her on the map, is a sexual examination of the Little Red Riding Hood story. The moments in that film, within the film,
Hmm.
were more interesting than what I saw here.
So what?
I
Okay.
saw what here was I kind of felt like they were trying to serve two masters where for some insane way they were sticking to the child aspect of fairy tales, which is good for what it is, but this is an adult oriented film and it should have went further into that direction. So you should have understood the sexual. What is there? Three stories in this film? Three, maybe four stories. The
Well, it's
Stephen
so
Ray
yeah. So it's
story. Yeah.
So it's like what it is like a frame story. So basically, it's a story about a girl. It's basically these vignettes that are framed by the story of this girl in her bed,
Mm-hmm.
asleep. Um, and within these dreams that this girl is having, there's the character of Rosaline. And Rosaline lives with her parents in this village, but she also visits her grandmother in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
And her grandmother, played by Angela Lansbury, who plays a great grandmother,
Yeah, she's wonderful
not a
in it.
great, not great grandmother as in the relationship
Yeah.
in the family tree, but I mean like a great, amazing grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh,
There's star power there. You're watching years of theater and film
yeah,
performances. You know going all the way back to Gaslight, if you've ever seen that film. I mean, you
and
know,
that's where that term gaslighting comes from.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so, okay, so then in her interactions with her grandmother, Angela Lansbury,
Mm-hmm.
Rosaline listens to all of these stories about stay on the path, etc. So, what we're really looking at in this film is a sexual coming of age allegory. So, the primary story is this adaptation of Little Red Riding Hood, which goes back to Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know the Little Red Riding Hood story. Basically, there's a girl in a red hood, and what happens to her? She's supposed to stay on the path through the woods on her way to take food to her grandma, right?
Yeah.
So on the way to her grandma's house, she meets a wolf, and she interacts with the wolf, and the wolf distracts her and says, "Go get some. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to my grandma's. Oh, okay, maybe you should go get flowers and take them to her." So while she's going to do that, he gets there first, and so he pretends to be the girl, and he gets into the house. Then he eats the grandmother. Then by the time that Little Red Riding Hood arrives at her grandma's house, she goes in and she sees her grandmother in bed, but her grandmother looks different. And she says, "Grandma, what big eyes you have." And the grandma's like, "The better to see you with." And it goes through these steps. And then eventually it's like, "Grandma, what a big mouth you have." And the grandma says, "The better to eat you with," because it's not the grandma, it's the wolf. And then the wolf eats her. The end. And there are more cleaned up versions of that, but that's the horror one. And remember, this in the context of horror this is how horror starts. This is the genre is we're sitting around the campfire telling each other scary things, right? This is horror. These are the stories that we tell. Within this film, based on this work of Angela Carter, including the screenplay,
Yeah.
you have the onset and arrival of puberty / womanhood, and the idea of blood, the idea of pubic hair being hairy on the inside, hairy on the outside, the werewolf, right? You have 3 female characters. We have 4, but 3 primary female characters within the stories inside the frame. And these kind of fit with the pagan female archetypes that go through the ages of a female. So you have the maiden, the mother, and the crone, the hag, the old lady. So the crone is here the grandmother, Angela Lansbury. She's wise in this case, but the difference is that it's not just wisdom here. She represents, she's actually, you can say, the villain. She's in a sense kind of like this unreliable narrator in the story, because we see her as this sweet woman, but what is she always telling Rosaline? She's always telling Rosaline, stay on the path, stay on the path. She doesn't call her stupid, but she basically says, you don't know anything. She's saying that she's ignorant to the ways of the world and she needs to be careful because there are all these things out there that are going to get her, right? So on the surface, she's sweet, she's all this and that, but what does she represent as a symbol in this allegory? She represents society telling this girl to remain in her place, to remain safe in her little place. She's the grandmother. The mother character is a different kind of example for Rosaline because she's a wife, but there's a strength to her, especially in this 1700s kind of time period that we're in. Rosaline sees her parents having sex, and she asks her mom if she felt pain, if it hurt her, if the father had hurt her, and the mom is like, no. There was no shame, there was no sense of, oh well, maybe at first it's going to hurt you and all. None. It was just no, which means that opens up the possibility for what? For pleasure. And she's like, well, Grandma says that we need to be careful because some men are hairy on the outside, but some men are also hairy on the inside, meaning the wolf within, right?
Yeah.
And all of that, we know what that represents. It represents nature, and this is a very pagan film. It represents nature and those forces and chaos, but also potential power. And the mom says, well, she juxtaposes it to man. She's like, well, man's met his match with woman. So that's already
I did like that line. That was a line that I liked. That's a
powerful. Yeah. She's not a victim. He's met his match with women. So they're on equal footing. But there's something there. Now, Rosaline, what does that mean? Rosaline, the little rose, that's the pinkness, the redness. We know what that means, the little rose. The small rose. Puberty, identity, coming, pun intended, into her own being. As a side note, you have her sister, and I was watching this with Leslie, and Leslie, with her goodbye every time a character is about to die. And
I would kill your girlfriend. You know that, right? There'd be no way. It just wouldn't happen.
She's the final girl. She makes it to the end. She's like, yeah, of course, the hotter one is the one that's going to have to die. And I'm like, yeah, she's the one that gets chased through the woods. So it's interesting also to follow that horror trope is like the so-called hotter one. But to get back into this, what we're talking about, the straying from the past, it's not necessarily, and I get this, like a lot of times you want more emotional depth or whatever from these characters. That's something that you bring up a lot when something don't connect. You're like, I didn't get enough. But a lot of times these things are just more symbolic or more visual based. So to get through the woods, it's only when Rosaline strays from the path that she comes into her own. She strays from the path. She's with this little boy who likes her or whatever, who kind of in the romance novel genre, he's just kind of like he's the lame guy who likes her. Her first little love interest until the bad boy comes. And so she runs away from him or whatever. She's off on her own. What does she do? She climbs the heights. She strays from the path and she climbs the heights of the tree. So she ascends, she climbs. She finds a mirror in a nest filled with eggs. I mean, eggs, a nest, we understand the symbolism. We know what that means, but also a mirror. And it just doesn't mean vanity. It means identity, to be able to see yourself. She gets lipstick. It's at that point that she looks at herself and she paints her lips red. Obvious, right?
Yeah.
Red lips. The evolutionary psychologists talk all about this type of shit. Like, according to their theory, it's like this is, all of these adaptations and all these reasons how we've evolved to attract the opposite sex for the purpose of procreation. And I'm saying specifically the opposite sex in this sense because it's strictly talking about evolution towards procreation. I'm not talking about other variations within our sexual being, which obviously, like, there's not only this, there is a this thing called homosexuality,
Sure. Yeah.
That's a different allegory of looking at oneself in the mirror and coming into one's own power. That's a different story, and those are out there too. But this kind of thing can also be applied to any kind of, beyond the specifics of an adolescent female. This can also be, you can apply this to a trans female adolescent who is seeing oneself in the mirror as one should see oneself. This can apply to, whatever it is, the identity and coming into one's own power, it can apply. This is specifically to this. But going back to the evolutionary psychology and the Red Riding Hood, big eyes, big mouth. I mean, look at that whole fucking Ahegao. You've seen this, that porn kind of trope of that character, which is the girl has her eyes rolled back, kind of crossed, with the mouth open. Mm-hmm. The Japanese anime thing and all that. There's something that it does to the male heterosexual brain, that it looks like what we know it looks like, and that draws our attention to it. What big eyes you have, what big mouth you have, right? The better to look at you with, to eat you with. The huntsman is a werewolf. That's the bad boy. That's the one she's attracted to. That's the Lord Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. This is the archetype of the romance, the gothic. Look at Heathcliff. It's not only Fabio way back in the day. I can't believe it's not butter, whatever the fuck. Like, no shirt. It's not only that. This goes into actual highbrow literature shit too. There's a book, Dangerous Men and Adventurous Women, talks about these symbols in romance novels. So she meets this huntsman, and right away there's this attraction. And then it goes through the Red Riding Hood story. And of course, the huntsman gets to the grandma's house first. And now the huntsman confronts Angela Lansbury's character. So you have burgeoning, blossoming sexuality, nature, raw, wild power against the so-called wisdom of conventional thinking of your society. And though, of course, he fucking knocks her head off and it shatters. It's not like it's a flesh and blood thing. The grandma is basically like porcelain. She just shatters. So it's not a bloody, fleshy substance, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now what happens? Rosaline arrives. She finds the wolf. And maybe this is something where you would have wanted more of a struggle or more of something.
No, not at all.
It Okay,
No,
well,
what I
correct me
wanted
after.
was
So
more the struggle throughout.
okay,
I'm not talking about a
well,
comp. I'm not talking about a climax. Maybe that was where the interpretation was. I wasn't making myself clear. It was an over because I was bored and distracted throughout the film. Once the film didn't
got it.
capture my attention and that first story left me feeling like, oh, okay, Stephen Ray goes off for a long time and now he comes back and he's this thing, and it was boring to me.
Okay,
It didn't explore
so let me
it's.
finish.
Oh, God, please, I'm sorry.
That way we can go back into why you didn't like it. Um, so then,
Yeah.
um, don't fucking blue ball me. So then, let me finish, right?
Go ahead, brother.
Climax.
Do your
Getting to
take.
the climax. So then, so now she confronts the wolf,
Yeah.
and the expectation from the viewer who is at least remotely interested, um,
Yeah.
is that that there will be this fucking some kind of struggle, and is this person going to victimize her or eat her or whatever, or is she going to fucking like put up this huge struggle and somehow like kills him? She's into it, and she isn't. It's kind of like, okay, she realizes that her grandma's dead, but she doesn't fucking care. Um, and is it the kind of the does as you yawn, you know?
Yeah.
Is
I
it
get a
the
lot of
she
sleep last
doesn't
night. I'm sorry. Just please. I
is
apologize.
it that's not, don't apologize to me.
Mm.
The 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 character, it's not like, oh, she doesn't care, I don't believe this. This is me.
Hmm.
I wasn't like, oh, I don't believe how this is so unrealistic, because obviously this is magical. This is
Yeah.
something else. She doesn't care because this is a better alternative than her grandma telling her to stay on the path. But at the same time, she is kind of like pissed. Like, who the fuck are you?
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is that she wounds him. She shoots him. And by wounding him, then he turns into not this werewolf transformation thing. He's partially like it, but he becomes an actual wolf. He becomes the wounded wolf. Then she doesn't try to tame him. She isn't harmed. She isn't victimized by him. After she hurts him, she becomes herself a wolf.
Yeah.
Her grandma had to die so that all that she would represent would die. And the deep passion, the wild woman archetype of the Women Who Run with Wolves book, the Clarissa Pinkola Estes book, this character that is now the pubic hair, the blood, the changes of the body, it's not fucking horrible. It may look horrible at first, or in the beginning of Carrie,
Yes.
it may be an object of through the eyes of that kind of person. It's like, well, yes, this is gross, this is that, but at the same time I want to film it like in a very lush and kind of like through this silky fucking aperture or whatever. So it looks like sexualized, but at the same time, it's not this ambiguity of all that. This is no, but it's not to become a werewolf. It's the changes of the body are that I grow breasts, I bleed now, but I don't die. I get hairy. I feel all these things, and fuck it. You know what I mean? Like, this is who I am. I'm going to embrace this. She becomes the wolf, and now this little crucifix is hanging around her neck, but it means nothing. It's just as if it were nothing, no power, no nothing. And she runs off. And then in the end, as this girl's asleep, you have the wolves breaking in, breaking through the windows, breaking all these things. Um, I thought all of this was very interesting because it was just a different way of looking at the werewolf. It
Mm-hmm.
was a different way of looking at the Red Riding Hood character. It was a different way of looking at. I thought it was very clear to me what these kind of a particular type of feminist approach to it, and it wasn't like I'm woman, I'm she wolf, hear me roar, but I'm gonna fucking but fuck men, we need men like a werewolf needs a bicycle. It wasn't that. Um, it this was no, this is who I am, and this is like my tribe. This is the idea of nowadays you hear about women in particular, like the rewilding of oneself.
Yes.
And this is the rewilding, and I'm all for the message um, of coming into one's own being and not being constrained by the expectations of society. In that sense, I still hold on to what everyone as an adolescent kind of like, that little wolf, that 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 little howl that everyone feels as a teenager, and then slowly we fucking let that die. I thought this was interesting. It was different. It was beautiful, and I liked it. And now I'm interested in this woman, Angela Carter's work and her plays with these allegories and her feminism within these stories. I thought it was cool and new and different.
See, I like what you're saying about it, but your reading is more interesting to me than the actual film that I watched. And the elements are there. It's like you and I read the same fucking book, same words, same sentences coming together, and yet the story that was being told seemed to be a little bit more compelling for you based on whatever you bring to it. And for me, it was
So what do I bring
like
to it that
I
you
don't know.
don't?
I don't know
That's
what
the
you bring
question.
into it. That's
Because you're
that's
saying
that's
we're
a
reading the
question that
same
you,
book.
yeah. But that's everything. That's all kinds
I
of
sure
art.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
but at a certain point, you said it yourself. It's not like you're saying, well, your reading of it is more interesting, but it's not that I read this, the different text, this different. I didn't. You and I did watch the same movie.
We what?
The
Yeah.
difference between the interpretation is that it just didn't interest you.
It didn't
Um,
interest me, but it's
but
like,
here's the thing:
mm-hmm,
it's not at that point, and we've had this discussion
mm-hmm,
many times with Bellatar, with aspects of rock and roll, with aspects of other
mm-hmm.
foreign films, maybe with French cinema, and we'll have it again.
Oh, this
It
story is going to
falls
play out many
sometimes.
times. This story is going to play out many times.
Sometimes I can see how it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be an issue of the film, but there are other times, maybe in this one, when it's not an issue of the film, it's an issue of you.
No, I in those other films, whether with genres of music, Bellatar, and even this, for example, there are things that are admirable about it. I mean, even with the Turin Horse, I can go back to it and I can say, you know what, I loved the look of the film. I loved the cinematography of it. There were certain aspects of it that I thought really worked, but for the
And you
most
don't have
part,
to
it
love
doesn't.
it.
Yeah,
It's
but ultimately, it's did I enjoy that ride and did I take enough out of it to make me feel as though the time was. There's a difference between time well spent and time wasted. As I look back on the films that we've differed on, I don't feel that the Turin Horse was a wasted time, but I don't think it was necessarily well spent. It
so
didn't.
what's the
It
difference?
didn't.
I mean,
Well,
I
here's
understand the
here's the
difference between, but
difference.
what
Yeah.
is why for each artifact, why for each thing
Hmm.
is it like the common denominator is not the common denominator is you. So what is it?
Not
And I get it.
always. Not always. It's sometimes the common denominator, yes, is me, but that's not always the deciding factor when you take into account a director's self-importance, a director's limited ability in some cases, a director or an actor or a writer's shortcomings in other respects. What
And
what we
and
have here
yeah,
is
hold on,
common.
real
Yeah,
quick. Don't get me wrong. Like, I don't expect anyone to be all about every fucking movie.
yeah.
That's not the thing. The thing is, there are times when it's the trick is to distinguish between this. There's something missing from this film,
Hmm.
or or it's you.
Okay,
There's
let's
there.
take that.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and I've discussed this in the past with you. Let's take Ingmar Bergman and David Lynch as one example. Now with Scorsese, boom, real early on, young man, disenfranchised images of men on screen, very easy for a young man to latch onto and to embrace. I think
Particularly young man. You as a young man.
as in particular me as a young man, but also other men that I've and some people absorb these films differently than others and take the wrong
Yeah.
view of them. I think a lot
Yeah.
of
For
people
sure.
interpret Taxi Driver in the wrong way, Raging Bull in the wrong way, but that's just a matter of the culture. Now we have talked in the past how it would take me decades to be able to really come into a David Lynch viewing experience. The same can be said of Bergman.
Mm.
With Lynch, it was my need to get away from what I have called and you have commented on my adversity or my prejudice against white shit. David Lynch
Hmm.
is very white shit, so that's at 48 or at 41, whenever we went to see Wild at Heart, is
Hmm.
when I embraced and really took in. Now with as I grow older and I find the magic and the beauty of a Mulholland Drive and the excitement and going back to Blue Velvet, Inland Empire, Lost Highway, all of that. It's a reading that wasn't possible at that age. So there is that. Bergman, it's very difficult for a young man who hasn't lived life in respect to relationships to absorb a Bergman film because so much of what he does was, uh, uh, aside from The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries, both films that I love for different reasons. Seventh Seal because it's just a masterpiece of cinema, and Wild Strawberries because of my old man thing. Persona, Cries and Whispers, what's the one that's the breakdown of a marriage? Those are going to be a different read, and you have to live. You
Well,
have
there's
to,
Hour of the Wolf. There's
yeah. Well,
Hour of the Wolf. There's the Through the Glass Darkly.
yeah, those are ones that I didn't particularly care for at the time, but I'm gonna have to. But I'm willing to give another chance. I'm talking about the one Scenes from a Marriage. Scenes from a Marriage. I'm looking at. I want to dive into. That's a 6 hour dive though, but that's having never been married, having never been close to being married or been in love to the point where you can do that. Um, I can still approach a film like that because of the experience of knowing people who have been married and listening to them talk and
You
absorbing
can
that
also
information
imagine
in a way.
yourself in
Yeah,
these roles. You can,
yeah.
whether that
And also
seems
why I
limited or
wouldn't
whatever.
do
Yeah.
it. It,
Sure. Yeah.
but you know what I mean. So there's all of that. Now with the other things, um, I've lost my origin. I don't know where this tangent began.
So we were talking about, like, okay, being able to honestly make the distinction between, is this
Oh,
something
the
that I have
shortcoming that I
issues
have.
with?
Yes.
Is it do I think that this
Hmm.
is of uh, something with the film, or is this me?
Yes.
And I think that, and I'm pushing on you
Hmm.
because it's like I there is obviously the possibility that we would externalize
Yeah.
just as people, that we're going to be like, well, it's the movie, it's not me.
Well, with this, for example, I've seen this
Or it
story.
could be a both. It
Uh,
could be a little bit of like, you know what, like
yeah.
this just isn't my style.
There's
Which,
a
but if that's it, then I would expect to say that that's it.
well.
Versus this is a shortcoming of the film, or in the past you've called certain films a failure, and it's kind of like based on what? Failure based on what?
Well, if that's the angle that you take, then anything can be not necessarily a masterpiece, but a success in the eyes of what somebody else views it as. Paul Schrader said something really interesting in an interview that I read on BFI, where he was talking about Tarantino. He was talking about Quentin, and he said Quentin Tarantino can sit there and expound on the brilliance of Go Go Girls on Motorcycles. Let's just say that movie, or a
Hmm.
movie that I just made up. Go Go Girls on
Yeah,
Motorcycles
but
is a
I'm sure he
masterpiece.
has talked
Yeah,
about that film that
yeah,
you literally
exactly.
just made up. Yeah,
That's a masterpiece. He will go.
yeah,
He will go to his dying days saying that's a masterpiece. And Paul Schrader said it's not a masterpiece. It might be enjoyable, but it's not a fucking masterpiece. I can look at Midnight Run, my favorite film, the film that I go back to all the time. Is it a masterpiece? No. But does it
okay,
mean more to me than any other film that I've ever watched? Probably.
interesting.
Otherwise, I wouldn't go back to it as often as I do. Now,
Sure, yeah,
with something like this, it's not a matter of I don't understand the material, I don't relate to the material, because I used to think if a film is too much female centric, then maybe that's my problem with it. But I've seen female driven films. I've seen films that were about women and that were intrinsically about that specific struggle, or whatever that struggle is within the context of that story from a female perspective, which is very different from anything that I've experienced, and I can
hmm,
appreciate them. There was a moment there where I wanted to talk to you about upcoming months, and we've never really done addiction in film, and I was thinking about Michael Keaton in Clean and Sober from the 1980s. It's very interesting because Clean and Sober was a breakout film for Michael Keaton. It's nobody thought he could do drama. Nobody ever could. This was the Mr. Mom years, Night Shift. He was purely a comic actor, and he was pigeonholed in that. Then he goes and does Clean and Sober, which I remember being a good film with him as an addict. I think Kathy Baker is a woman that he meets in recovery, and Morgan Freeman is his counselor.
mm,
Already a great cast. I want to go back to this movie. But then later on in the mid 2000s, Sandra Bullock, who I think is a very underrated actor, I think people are very dismissive of her, but I
yeah,
think she's very good, both in comedy and drama. She did a film called 28 Days, which is, I think, pretty damn good. I think it has its moments that are, I think it has its cheesy moments, and I think it goes for cheap laughs here and there. But for the most part, you have Sandra Bullock, you have Diane Ladd, you have Viggo Mortensen as the semi-love interest, not really, and you have Steve Buscemi as her counselor. I would like to
okay.
go
So
and
you have, yeah,
look at these two films and parallel them. Now, the
it's an
point
interesting cast.
is it's a very interesting cast, and I think it's a mostly successful film. The
Sounds like
point that
white people shit to me.
it
I'm
is
just
very
kidding.
much white people shit. There's almost no ethnicity in these films, but when you watch the fit, like I feel as though when a film is good and it speaks to a human experience, it really comes down to the execution. And with Company of Wolves, this is a human experience. This is burgeoning sexuality built into fairy tales that we have all grown up with, that we all know. I mean, I don't know how you grow up. I don't know how you grow up in society having never heard of Little Red Riding Hood
I mean, some
or The Boy
people
Who
come
Cried
from
Wolf.
another country, they don't know this fucking thing.
Not
It's
necessarily, because a lot of these stories are from Europe or are translated into other languages, and it's these are stories that are picked up throughout the world. Or there are variations of these stories. The wolf
sure.
theme is very prominent in most cultures. Africa has wolves, Europe has wolves, the Americas have wolves, and the wolf has a certain through line of that kind of nobility but danger. So these are stories that exist um, throughout time and culture. So
Yeah, I
all
mean,
of
you
the
can.
element,
Yeah,
yeah,
the this the Women Who Run with the Wolves book that I'm telling you about. Yeah,
hmm
she takes a broad kind of cross cultural exercise in doing this thing. So
yeah.
okay,
So all of that's there. So it becomes a matter of the execution. And the execution is where I have a problem with this film because it doesn't. Maybe logical conclusion is the wrong description of what I find lacking in this film. What I truly find lacking in this film is the depth and what it's willing to explore as far as this young girl's coming of age, how that is portrayed. Um, it's as if all of the ingredients are there, but the cake doesn't rise. For
so you
me,
just
that's
want
how it
more
works.
time spent. You just want more time spent going into the psychology of uh, why she would want to um, basically end up becoming a werewolf, or
That's one aspect of what I think is missing. Um, it's. I think you can go one of two ways with this film. You can become a little bit more explicit, or you can go far more dreamlike. And
explicit
I don't
meaning what? Do you
be
mean obvious, or do you mean like
obvious. Yes, obvious.
sexually
No,
explicit?
no, no, no. I'm not looking for a sexually explicit film. If I want sexually explicit, I'll just fucking watch porn, and that's no, I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested is in sexual psychology and
And
what
a
she's
side
going
note,
through.
like it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be porn if it's explicit. You can also like
Oh yeah.
we can yeah.
Of course, of course. But what I would have rather have gone for, and maybe Neil Jordan isn't capable of this, I would have gone for a more psychological dream-like examination where it can be interpreted multiple ways. I don't see this as being multiple interpretations. I think it's a very obvious interpretation of what these stories have been
Well,
told
I
to
think
us as.
it's a specific. I don't think it's necessarily obvious because it's opposite. So
Mhm.
it's a specific um interpretation. So you want something that's a little bit more now to do this interpretation, you can't have it go a number of different ways. It has to
Well,
be
no, no, I wouldn't say that you can't do anything. I mean, I would have liked to have seen a Lynch approach, a Cronenberg approach, a darker, more.
and those
I
are
just
also
didn't.
different approaches. But yeah.
They're very different approaches, but I'm showing an example. I'm
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not
Hmm.
confusing Lynch and I'm not
No, of
confusing
course.
Lynch and
Yeah.
Cronenberg in any way. I know that they're very different filmmakers, but I feel as though they handle material in a more. I think both of those directors are more in tune with the darker side of their psyches. Um, and I think Neil Jordan is not in that place. I think he does From what I've seen, I think he does more straightforward kind of looks at life. I think the material demands a more dreamlike story, storytelling. Maybe a darker Terry Gilliam.
Okay.
Because Gilliam, I don't think if you've seen the Brothers Grimm, you can see that Gilliam doesn't really pull it off, and that seems to be Gilliam's bag. It would seem to be something that Gilliam would excel at. And however, you can put a lot of that blame for that film on the Weinsteins, so as you
Sure.
could do with so many other things. But
Those werewolves.
yeah,
Well, that one, you know.
yeah,
Well, okay, that's interesting because have you seen The Crying Game?
no,
Some of what you're describing, that maybe like more psychological, maybe more. Okay, I'm not going to go into the. It's been a long time since I've seen The Crying Game, and I
hmm
don't want to. Especially, I'm sure you know somewhat what it's about.
I know what it's about, and I know the big reveal. So
Okay. Um, okay. That's basically as far as because other people at some point I'd like to do that film.
okay,
Uh, in terms of what it's about and the reveal and all that, which kind of how much like I think some of that is kind of we, there's an understanding um, as you're watching it, but maybe some of those elements are better brought into play in that something like that film, which is not dreamlike, but it does have more of a more of the Stephen Ray, his kind of how he's affected by some of these attractions and by
hmm
some of this stuff going on, and how maybe
yes,
that affects him psychologically, and how so it's like I get from that perspective. I think it's more clear to me. For example, we talked about the Wolfman adaptation with Benicio del Toro
hmm Anthony Hopkins,
and and Blunt. What's her name? Emily
Emily
Blunt.
Blunt, yeah,
And I talked about their relationship didn't. To me, it felt like it could have been stronger. Um, and then I used as an example, and especially this kind of danger, this mixed emotional relationship I think that a film like that demands that they should have. And I talked about Sicario, which they're both in, and they have scenes together, and they
yeah,
have a relationship. They don't have a romantic relationship, but they do have a relationship as characters in the film that is very ambiguous. And there is mention of wolves just as a cherry on top.
yeah,
Um, and I mentioned that at the end of the film, this moment where they have this kind of this last interaction, and it has not the hint, it has the very definite threat of violence and death. But at the same time, there is this hint of tenderness between them, but also like, this is what needs to happen. I'm fucking trying to save you, but if you don't do this, you know what's going to happen. So you decide. That to me was more of this werewolf and the threat of that and becoming part of that and all this, like that kind of thing.
hmm
So I understand. If and maybe this is I'm glad we got to this place where we're talking about it in terms of sometimes we can't articulate what we feel that was missing,
hmm
and that may not even be something wrong with the film itself. We just talked about Horror Noir, the documentary, and I had definite issues that I was able to say, I think this was an issue with the film because I think that it was missing this.
yeah,
Sometimes you can't put a finger on, like, you taste some food and you're like, it's missing something, but I
Yeah.
don't know what it is.
Yeah.
If we're able to arrive at that and be clear that that's what it is, so that it's not like it's either, oh, I'm so I don't accuse you of being closed-minded or vice
Yeah.
versa, or else we don't say, oh, the film sucks. But the idea that maybe in the hands of someone else it would have been a different version of it,
Mm-hmm.
that would have had that thing that I don't know what's missing, but just a little bit of cinnamon, or I don't know what it needed, that would have been blah blah blah. It makes sense to have seen this. A Cronenberg would have been more psychological. Um, a Cronenberg would have touched on also the physicality of the horror. Um, these changes that maybe arouse her but also horrify her at the same time. The animality of of the wolf, Cronenberg.
Yeah.
David Lynch, it would probably be two versions of the same character, to like doing like this very surreal, very dreamlike, nightmarish, but also like under the surface of the village, under the surface of village life, this horror bubbling up. You know what I mean? Like, so it's interesting
Well, it's
how
yeah.
this has played itself.
All of this is it's I don't want a film
Woody
to.
Allen, the neurosis of 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 feeling yourself attracted to the wolf and talking about that neurosis for
Mhm.
2 hours.
Yeah. See, I think that's I don't necessarily want it to be I don't want to be able to put my finger exactly on the pulse of what the problem is with a film all the time. It's like when we go back to Tideland. I don't know what it is about that film that I do like, but there is something about it that I like. Apart from the obviousness of the design of the film and the look of the film and the lead performance of the little girl, it's an uncomfortable film, but there's also something about it that is compelling. This doesn't have that. This doesn't make me want to go back to it. This doesn't make me, um, but I like when a film confuses me, and not confusing as far as what what did what the fuck was that? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more along the lines of why can't I get this fucking movie out of my head?
Mm.
That's the best kind of movie. And when I was starting to come into my own on my understanding of Lynch, I was very dismissive of Blue Velvet. Then we went to see Wild at Heart, and I did not understand why I liked that movie. But and I still kind of don't understand why I like the movie, but little things about it have stuck with me. That's a fairy tale. That's Wizard of Oz.
Yeah,
There's a
it
lot
has
of there's a lot of
definitely
direct
lots of
link. Yeah,
callbacks. Yeah,
yeah. There's a lot of direct lifting, and that's what I love about Lynch's about that film, and that's why I'm excited for Inland Empire. That's why I'm excited to go back to Lost Highway and Blue Velvet. Eraserhead just freaks me out, but I know I have to go back there. So it's
yeah,
a matter
sure.
of I have to go back to these films. Like I mentioned Midnight Run, Taxi Driver, I don't have to go back to those films. I want to go back to those films. I want to. I will go. I will see Midnight Run again before the end of the year. Taxi Driver will play on a Saturday afternoon. Raging Bull as well. I have to force myself to watch the Lynch films, even though I want to. You want to talk about something that scares the shit out of you and you don't understand why? Lynch freaks me out. Not as much as he once did, because I have greater control over it now. I understand that there's something there. I don't have that with this film. And this film has the ability to do that. The material is there to make you uncomfortable. I want to be uncomfortable in movies. I want to feel like I'm watching something that I shouldn't be watching. And I that's the approach that Jordan should have had with this material.
I mean,
For me,
for
to
that
make it work,
specifically, yeah,
for me.
that falls to you, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas I think, for me, it was I rooted for once she becomes that wolf. It was like good. I want her to go and be that fucking wolf.
Yeah.
And and it was one of those things. It was also opposite in the fact of like, I know what this. I know how I'm interpreting this, and it feels like this is the message of the film. And I recognize it in the same way that, like, if you know a piece of music and you know it really well, but you also understand, for whatever reason, whether you have however much knowledge you have or whatever, but if you know a certain piece of music and you know kind of like a certain technique or a certain thing that's being done at that point, you feel like you're in on it.
Yeah.
You feel like you understand it. You feel like I get this. And because you get it, you can understand it all the more deeply. And so for me, it wasn't a moment of like, oh, I'm recognizing this. Oh, it's fucking obvious. This is, now I'm like, oh, okay. Because there are moments like that too with anything. This was more like, okay, they're subverting this old narrative. They're subverting the expectations. They're doing this. They're doing that. Okay. Where does this come from? Oh, Angela Carter. Who's Angela Carter? Oh, and then she has this stuff, and I'm like, now I want to read Angela Carter because I want to see how it reads versus how it looks on screen. And obviously there's going to be a difference there. And so I was pleasantly surprised, and I was surprised to see a cameo of Terrence Stamp.
Oh, I love that. That was a great moment.
I wasn't surprised to see Stephen Ray because Stephen Ray comes out in his films.
Yeah.
But I when I found out that Stephen Ray was in it, I felt that he would have been. I expected for him to be in more of the film.
Yeah.
And he's just in like one of the vignettes. But for me, it was all of what I said, plus again, kind of like this thing of like, now I want to explore more of some of these 80s dark fantasy films that I haven't seen in fucking forever. These old fucking stuff, these old things that I would see on TV or the VHS or whatever, and these, I've talked about Never Ending Story and that, but this kind of fits into that, but more than just an update for a mature audience. This is more psychological in terms of getting into the symbolism and it definitely is this coming of age story, and I thought it was well done. Our expectations were different.
Yeah.
And so for us, the film was different, but ultimately the film is the same.
Well,
still the same film.
Listening to you talk about it, and the drive that you have for digging deeper into the work of Angela Carter, it has me thinking that maybe there is something there that's not available in this film. Because, like I said, there are elements that really work for me. The idea of what the film is going to be works and is compelling. I don't particularly care for the execution, but that's not necessarily the writer. So if there's more to it and Angela Carter is able to deliver, maybe I need to make the movie in my head based on what she provides. The old way, going back to, the cinema of the mind. I like that. I like that possibility. it's worth looking into. So, that being said, we continue to look for your support. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/watchRickRamos. You can give any amount. Hey, we've been doing this since what, 2015, 2016 together?
15.
2015. So we're talking about 8 years of grinding it out, putting our heart and soul into it. It's not like we're going to stop recording, but it's always helpful to pay the bills, to get a little bit, to take care of what needs to be taken care of. And if you feel
It's
that
the
you've
blood
taken,
money.
yeah. If you feel that you've taken something from what we do, if you enjoy what we do, and you can find it in your heart to just, throw some money in, hey, you spend money on a lot of shit that doesn't give you anything. If you could throw a little bit our way, we would certainly appreciate it, and would continue to, it would keep us continuing on this path. So we say thank you
Yeah.
very much. Wishing you the
We're your
best.
sacred prostitutes. Your holy whores.
The holy horrors. You be good. We'll be back with yet another exploration of that dark genre of horror. Have a good one. Bye bye now.